What's going on, guys? Billy here, and over the past month I've been using the new 3rd generation 12.9-inch iPad Pro, which is an absolutely gorgeous looking device, but as you can see by my title, I don't think that the 3rd generation iPad Pro is really a significant upgrade over the 1st generation iPad Pro. I've been using this 1st generation 12.9-inch iPad Pro now for about 3.5 years, and it still runs flawlessly. Sure, the design might look a little bit dated with the larger bezels and non-120Hz screen, but other than those two things, I really haven't found a major reason to upgrade. With the hype surrounding the newest iPads, I figured it was time to make the leap and upgrade to leave the archaic Touch ID and home button in the past. I'm kidding, of course, but bouncing back and forth between my iPhone XS Max and my 1st generation iPad Pro, using the gestures and Face ID on my phone, and then having to use the Touch ID and home button on my iPad was sometimes a little bit confusing, and now everything just is the same and it's a lot more fluid. So with my use of the iPad Pro 3rd generation, I figured I'd do something a little bit interesting for this video and compare the 3rd generation to the 1st generation to see what's different and how far Apple has come, and again, why I think it's really not that much worth the upgrade if you already have that 1st generation iPad Pro. So let's get into it. First up, I want to discuss the design because that's pretty much where we see the biggest change between these two devices. Now, the footprint of the iPad Pro 3rd generation is smaller than the 1st generation, but still features the same 12.9-inch screen. It's also just slightly thinner, but the camera bump on this new device is massive compared to a lot of the other smartphones out right now. I always liked how there was no camera bump on my 1st generation iPad, as I frequently would rest it flat down on the table, and I didn't want to deal with the device rocking back and forth as I typed or drew on the iPad, although that's not actually the case now with the iPad Pro 3rd generation. It doesn't move when you touch the outer corners like the most recent iPhones do, which is definitely a good thing. As a whole, I'm a big fan of the industrial design with the darker space gray color and the straighter edges, which we haven't seen in an iPad since the first one ever made back in 2010. Now, it wouldn't be fair to compare these two devices without talking about the screen, because in the 2 generations of upgrades, I think that this is where the biggest change lies. The corners are now rounded, the bezels have shrunk, the display feels all around brighter, and of course, the 120Hz refresh rate is just so satisfying. Even scrolling between the apps feels like a brand new experience, but is noticeable throughout any of the apps that I use or the games that I play. If I had to say I was upgrading for a particular reason, this would probably be it. Now, just to touch on the shrinking of these bezels just a little bit more, they might not be as thin as those on the iPhone or any other Android phones on the market that are really pushing that screen to body ratio, but unlike a phone where you can rest in the palm of your one hand and use with the other hand, you need somewhere to grip the tablet on the front, so this remaining bezel is probably as small as we'll see them get, unless a company decides to create some crazy design that stands out. But if that happens, I don't think that I would purchase it, because again, I really do value that bezel space on the front so I can grip it like a tablet. To wrap up the talk on design, I want to touch on 2 more things that have changed from the 1st generation iPad Pro now to the 3rd generation iPad Pro. The first is the new Usbc charging port. Now, no matter what, I would count this as a significant upgrade over Apple's proprietary Lightning port, as this is slowly becoming the only cord that I need. Here's the thing though, iOS is so limiting that the one big thing I actually wanted to use this port for doesn't work, and that's connecting a hard drive. It gives you an error that states contents not available, and all of this boils down to how this powerful iPad Pro is being held back by its operating system, which I will definitely get into later in this video. So as of right now, in late 2018, almost all of Apple's devices have been refreshed, and they've added at least one USB-C port for us to use, except for probably their most popular device, and that is the iPhone. So what I'd say is, if they don't refresh their iPhones in the next year to actually incorporate USB-C, the upgrade to USB-C on the iPad is pretty much going to be pointless. The final point I want to touch on is the camera, which, as I already stated, is raised from the body, and although it is better, I'm not trying to have a photo shoot with my iPad, so for me, the 1st generation iPad Pro camera gets the job done. If I need to scan any sort of files or share anything with anybody else, I probably would rather take the worst camera for no camera bump. Before we get into software, I quickly want to take a detour and talk about the 2 core accessories for the iPad Pro, the pencil and the keyboard. Now, over the first 2 generations, they stayed the same essentially, but now with the 3rd generation, they have been totally overhauled. The biggest change is the pencil, with the ability to magnetically attach to the side and to wirelessly charge through that connection is genius. I use this as a student, so I actually get a good amount of use out of the Apple Pencil writing notes, so I'm happy that there's a new method to hold the pencil, as I was always left left wondering where to put it, in my pocket or in my backpack. The old method of having to plug that pencil into the iPad to charge worked. I mean, it got the job done, but it was definitely a silly alternative to what we now have a few years later. The keyboard also saw some design tweaks as it wraps around the entire body instead of just attaching to the one side of the iPad. This offers better protection, especially to that back camera bump, and now I feel like it's a bit easier to open up and just start typing. As far as the keys are concerned, I don't think that there is much of a difference in terms of clickiness, although my old iPad's keyboard feels a bit mushy, although that could have been just from years of constant use. Up to this point, you might be thinking that I've actually done the opposite of what my title says, and I've proved to you that the third generation iPad Pro is a worthy upgrade over the first generation iPad Pro, but the iPad's biggest limitation is its operating system, iOS. The iPad is essentially a bigger iPhone that has some unique features like split screen and the larger dock, but at the end of the day, it is stupidly overpowered. The first generation iPad Pro is rocking the Apple A9X chip, 4GB of memory, 128GB of storage, which was, I believe, the biggest at the time, and also a 10,307 mAh battery. The third generation iPad Pro is rocking the Apple A12X Bionic chip, 4GB of memory on my 512GB storage option, although the 1TB storage configuration comes with 6GB of memory, and the battery is surprisingly just a little bit smaller at 9,720 mAh. The Geekbench scores certainly show that the third generation iPad Pro pretty much destroys the first generation by doubling the single core score and almost quadruples the multi-core score. This leads me all the way back to the operating system. Why would you need a device this powerful running iOS? I mean, I've used my first generation iPad Pro through 3 different versions of iOS without a single hiccup, and still to this day running iOS 12, there has not been once where this device has lagged on me, where it has force quit out of apps, where it has shuttered when using 2 apps at once. I mean, really, it hasn't hindered in performance whatsoever. That right there is my biggest argument as to why the third generation iPad Pro is not worth the upgrade over the first generation of iPad Pro. It still runs iOS flawlessly, and it's probably going to run it flawlessly for time to come, as the first generation iPad Pro is still an overpowered device. I could be proven wrong if like iOS 13 has a lot of iPad specific features that really do take advantage of that power, or if Apple ends up coming out with a totally new operating system that's like a hybrid between iOS and macOS made specifically for the iPad. Again, I could be totally proven wrong, and this video is totally invalid, but at the end of the day, if you've got a first generation iPad Pro, I'd recommend saving your money, rock what you've got, because it works great. Anyway, guys, let me know what you think down in the comment section, and as always, I'll talk to you later. Peace. Okay, so after shooting that entire video and then actually beginning to edit the first portions of it, I wanted to make something clear here at the end. I am in no way taking away from the power of the third generation iPad Pro. I think that it is silly how far ahead of the game Apple is with their tablets. There is no other manufacturer right now that is producing tablets as good as the iPad, and if anybody right now were to ask me what tablet would you recommend, I'd recommend the third generation iPad Pro, either the 11-inch or 12.9-inch, whatever floats your boat. I'd recommend either of those any day of the week, 10 times out of 10. But the real thing I wanted to accomplish with this video is to show you guys that the first generation iPad Pro really does stand a good chance against the third generation. It really does still hold up well in late 2018, I'd say, going on almost 4 years. If you look at something like an iPhone, right, this thing pretty much goes bad after 2 years. The iOS operating system is not optimized for it, and you're going to want to upgrade your phone more frequently than, say, your computer, but the same thing goes for your tablet. You don't need to upgrade your tablet every single year, because the first generation iPad Pro is still out there, it's still lurking, and you could probably get a really good deal on it, and you could get a really good tablet for a cheap price. So again, go easy on me down there in the comments. I just wanted to kind of reiterate myself that the third generation iPad Pro is a beast, but the first generation iPad Pro is also still kind of a beast. Anyway, guys, for real this time, I'll talk to you later. Peace.